I'm really delighted to introduce you to our speaker tonight. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Linda Mulcahy. I'm the Director of the Centre for Socio-Legal Studies here in Oxford, and I also, with my friend and colleague Marina Kukchayan, organised the Law in Society's research cluster here at Waltham. And one of the really wonderful things, of course, about organising a cluster is that you get to invite the people that you want to hear speak. So it really is my great pleasure tonight to introduce somebody whose books have really influenced my own work, and I cite extensively in my last book for the work that he's been doing on post-democratic societies. So I'd like to introduce you to Colin Crouch. He's an English sociologist and political scientist, fellow of the British Academy. And he's had a very distinguished career at the LSE and Oxford, and then the EUI in Florence and Warwick. He's currently an emeritus professor at the University of Warwick and an external scientific member of the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Societies. Colin coined the term post-democracy in 2000 in his book Coping with Post-Democracy, and he's developed that idea subsequently in a number of articles and other books. So I'm not going to talk too much about the value of that work because that's the subject of the lecture tonight. So I'm going to hand you over to Colin so you can listen to somebody much more interesting. And there will be a chance for questions at the end of the talk. So thank you again for coming, and I know you'll want to join me in welcoming Colin to Waltham.
Oh, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me here. I might have coined the phrase post-democracy, but I'm not sure. I've got a nasty feeling there was an article with that heading in La Repubblica, the Italian newspaper, by Ralph Dahrendorf, an Italian journalist. It's always bugged me a bit that I might not have made it up. I had a similar experience with something else. A few years ago, I invented a concept called privatized Keynesianism to describe what I saw as economic policy in the years running up to the financial crisis. And then eventually someone says, you realise you pinched this from two Italian economists. And look, it was an unpublished paper, so I couldn't have, but I wrote them a grovelling apology and said whenever I used privatised Keynesianism, I would always mention them, which I do. But I didn't used to be a student of democracy. I spent most of my career, as Howard Gospel down here knows, writing about employment relations and other issues of economic sociology, local economic development, vocational training, things of that kind. And I stumbled into studying democracy and politics as politics rather than as political sociology. I'm a sociologist. When the Fabian Society asked me, about not the year 2000 I think it was, asked me if I'd like to write something for them because I hadn't done so for decades. Now, usually a Fabian Society pamphlet is saying the government must do this, the Labour Party must do that, and you're always pointing the finger at some authority that should be doing something. And I thought, no, I'm going to write something different. I'm going to put the onus on ourselves. It's something we've got to do something about. And at that time, my younger son was in his early 20s and agonising about the awful state of politics. And he and I had a lot of conversations, and out of it I got this thought that perhaps democracy is sort of changing and we need to learn how to cope with it. And the Fabian Society pamphlet was called Coping with Post-Democracy. So it's not non-democratic, it's not anti-democratic, it's post-democratic. And I think that's how we often use these terms. And what I meant was that all the formal and some of the informal attributes of democracy still flourish. There are elections. Governments win and lose. Governments change at election time. There's enormous political debate in which people argue from lots of different positions. But it seemed to me while all that was going on, that the whole thing, it's not directly manipulated, but the whole thing really, the management of the whole thing had fallen into the hands of party professionals who manipulated an agenda and determined the agenda. And in my rather romantic way, I saw strong democracy as when things come up from the people, which governments are taken by surprise by, and they have to respond. And I felt we were moving away from that, if we'd ever been in it, and moving into a more manipulated kind of political world. In a way, the most perfect expression of what I was trying to describe has only happened years, in very recent years. And that's the use of bots by social media, where if you've got enough wealth, you can bombard people with millions of social media messages that give the impression that a very large number of people are engaged in a debate, a very lively debate. But actually, it's all controlled from a very small number of sources who produce this vast number of bots, often tailored to individuals' known prejudices and views. So in a way, that's been the most perfect post-democratic moment, I think, that we've had. Anyway, so I wrote this Fabian pamphlet, and I took it back to Florence, where I was working, gave it to an Italian friend of mine, who passed it on to a man called Giuseppe Laterza, who runs a publishing company of that name. And one day Laterza knocked on my office door. He said, look, make this less British, make it longer, I'll translate it into Italian, I can sell this as a book. But we can't call it Coping with Democracy, because you can't really say that in Italian. We just call it Post-Democracy. Having done that, he said, right, I'm now going to sell it to an English publisher and a German publisher. And it ended up by having more translations and more overall sales than anything else I'd ever done. With all those years, and I've worked hard at all the things I was working at. So it remains a puzzle to me as to why that happened. I obviously touched a chord somewhere. And then about 18 years later, Laterza and I met up and we said, let's try a sort of revisited of it. Let's see what's happened in the it'll be 20 years by the time it's published, the 20 years since. And I wrote that, Post-Democracy After the Crises. That hasn't had such a good career. It was published first in Italian. I remember being in Bologna at the end of January 2020, and I saw it in a bookshop. I thought, oh, it's been published, and they put it in the window. Great. The following week, COVID arrived in northern Italy. And if any of you published anything you wanted to get attention for in 2020 and 2021, you will know it was a waste of time. It was just drowned. So I just got the English, German and Italian for that book. But it's good, it's reached you. I see the flyer for this lecture has got the front cover of that book on it, so it's got to some places anyway. So that's what I meant by post-democracy. It's not something that I saw as a kind of conspiracy theory. I saw two main causes of it, for which no one is to blame. One is the globalization of the economy, which means that the major things happening in the economy are beyond the reach of nation states, which is the level at which democracy so far has been most successful. And so a whole load of things were just taken away from the political world. Now, in a way, at the moment, there is a deglobalization going on. For me, it's the wrong deglobalization, but still, there is some reversal of that happening at the moment. The other change that I saw was that people in the Western democracies were losing their connections to political parties. That people's social identities found it increasingly difficult to embrace a political identity. And this meant that parties were losing touch with the population. Party memberships were more and more a load of eccentrics, didn't really represent anyone, and therefore party leaders mistrusted their parties and tried to operate in a different world with media professionals and marketing people. And you get what's nowadays called retail politics. And it seems to me that was weakening the links. Now, this is a big theme that I'm going to come back to towards the end, but at the moment, just note it. I saw these two main causes of post-democracy, and no one is to blame. Now, I also didn't argue, and I still wouldn't argue, that we live in post-democratic societies. I argued in the first little book, and I would still say the same today, there's far too much goes on. In Western European countries, Central and Eastern Europe are more of a worry. Western European countries, the United States, Australasia, one or two other places, there is still an enormous amount of genuine liveliness in politics that defies the party managers. And in particular, I mentioned three movements that really continue to create discomfort and shocks for the system. One is feminism, a second is the environmentalism, and the third is xenophobic movements. Again, I'm going to come back and talk about those at the end in much more detail. But so I argued we're on the road to a post-democracy, but there are these signs of life out there in most of our societies, in the advanced democracies, that keep holding it at bay. That we're on the road, but we're only journeying slowly on that road. Now, you can criticize my argument from various points of view. I've often in my time criticized scholars for saying things used to be good in X years and now they're bad. And it's always a reference to when those people were young. And that's what I've done. Because my period when democracy is lively sort of runs from around 1945 to around 1970. And after that I start to age. And related to that criticism, some people have said, look, it's all very well, you're writing about a sort of nostalgia for a golden age, or perhaps a bronze age, of democracy. That was great for white blokes. But for women, ethnic minorities, gay people, disabled people, it's actually much better now. This is discomforting. I've thought about this one. And I would argue that most of the movements that have produced gains for these various groups, which are actually a large majority of society, actually started in the late 60s. And that, in fact, though we keep realizing more gains and we realize more and more issues affecting these things, those movements did actually start, all of them. You can state sometime between 1967 and 1971. It depends on the country you're talking about. So I can wriggle out of the criticism a bit. Now, what I want to do for most of the time today is to look. I'm not going to follow the 2020 book, the response to the crisis. I'm going to pick some themes from there and also some new themes of stuff that's happened since. But I want to go through about 4 issues which seem to me to be relevant to my post-democracy thesis and from which I've had to learn and correct and change what I've been saying. The first one, and in many ways I think still the biggest one, is the financial crisis of 2008 and the gradual deregulation of the financial sector that was taking place for about 10 years before that. And here we have a perfect example of my post-democracy, because what happened was the United States, after the Great Depression of 29 to 31, the United States introduced a lot of law limiting the freedom that financial institutions had to use other people's money. There were rules about what proportion of the resources they invested they actually had to own. There were, and a whole series of other rules about transactions. And eventually the banks were finding these irksome. And the late 1990s onwards, they started to lobby in Washington to have a deregulation of all this so that they could really use other people's money however they liked, and they could use money they didn't have however they liked. And the system would be a perfect example of post-democracy, where the politics becomes a game between political and economic elites. Leading figures from banks would go into the US Treasury, hold an office there, change the law to suit their bank, and go back into the bank. Sometimes they come back for a second stint in the Treasury. It's what they call the revolving door in the US, a constant between upper echelons of business and government, actual personnel themselves changing. We call this process lobbying, but that is actually an erroneous use of the word lobbying. And the word lobby comes from the idea of a room that is, or a space that is outside the chamber where the decisions are being made. So that little thing out there is a sort of lobby for this room. And in a medieval court, the king and his courtiers would meet in the council chamber to make their decisions. And as they were coming in to have their conversations, people with a cause to plead would be in the lobby standing, and they called them by the coat, say, please take this to the king. And so lobbyists were outside the chamber and trying to influence the people going into the chamber. But with the revolving door, there's no lobby anymore. They're in the chamber. And this has taken place over a very large number of fields of policy making. And it's what I mean by post-democracy. And it was there in spades in the deregulation of the US and eventually the global economy. And as the policymakers in the US in the 1930s would have predicted, you're going to get a crisis, huge, great crisis, one that we still haven't really recovered from. So, one up for my theory. But I then have to ask, supposing US democracy had been stronger, supposing the business lobbies hadn't been so powerful, supposing there had been far more interest groups able to have a stake, would it have been any different? And this is where I have to have pause for thought, because the thing about that deregulation in the context of the times in which it happened is that everybody loved it. What was happening with the deregulation of the rules about investing, at the same time that you got a change in accountancy practices so that when you're judging a firm's performance, you go through a process called mark to market. You don't examine what they're actually doing and their sales and their inventory and so forth. You look at their stock exchange price, much quicker process. So the value of a firm is its value on the stock exchange that day. It's not the value of its actual activities, which is why you find, especially in the tech sector, firms worth billions of dollars before they've even produced a product. And it also it gives rise to the concept of fake it till you make it. So you think you've got a great product, but before you actually make it, you pretend you've made it, and your share price goes up. And if you're lucky, you can keep postponing it. Every now and again, someone gets caught by it, but fake it till you make it, works with mark to market, and it enabled people in the financial sector to buy and sell assets without bothering to consider their actual worth in any long-term sense. What mattered was, is there someone you can sell that to who will buy it for more? And that person is saying, yeah, I'll buy it for more because I can sell it for even more. And it will go on. It can't be an infinite regress. And that's the whole point. But it looked as though it was. Because, again, the context of this period, it really was happening at the worst possible period in economic history. Because the Soviet Union had fallen, China was joining the capitalist economy. There were vast quantities of new money slushing around in the global economy. And people were trading in investments. And it looked as though there was no tomorrow. Eventually, there was a tomorrow. And it happened in 2008. But you can see how popular this was. It meant corporations, governments, individuals, even quite poor individuals, could benefit from all this by getting very cheap money. So I have to ask the question, would a stronger democracy have been any better? It might have been a democratic thing to do, to say, yeah, look, we can have low taxes and a lot of public policy and welfare benefits because we just postpone the debt till tomorrow and the day after tomorrow. The only thing one can say is that there were a few economists around who were warning about this all the time. They were ridiculed. They were treated as freaks, old-fashioned freaks. Eventually they were right, never got any credit. Now, one can argue that had the political system around that area of policy been more pluralistic, had more voices had a chance to enter the fray, governments might have been more cautious. Because in a lot of areas of policy, that does happen. And we do have a very rich pluralism in most of the advanced democracies. An issue comes up and immediately opinions on all sorts of sides get heard. It didn't about this issue. No one really, it was very, very small amount of debate, partly because it's too technical, partly because the financial lobbies are so powerful. But one can argue perhaps that if there's more pluralism, more different voices able to enter the political arena, then you might get more caution about these things. So that means stronger democracy is a necessary but not sufficient cause of a better way. I don't think you can have real plurality and a sort of throng of debate unless you've got democracy. Democracy is absolutely necessary for that, but it doesn't guarantee it. Because democracy can also lead to situations where everyone follows just the one thing and don't debate. So I don't score so many points out of that one. The second issue I want to look at is the corona crisis. Now, the coronavirus struck, as I said before, my book had just been published, but the German edition was a bit slow, and so I was able to get in the German edition, there's a chapter on COVID crisis that doesn't appear in the others. There are, I think, 3 points relevant to post-democracy come out of the COVID crisis, 2 of which I talked about in that German chapter, but one I didn't predict and is very uncomfortable. One that is, it certainly happened in this country and is documented by the National Audit Office. It may have happened elsewhere as well, I'm not sure. I've tried to poke around, but I haven't found much. And that was the way in which ministers and their associates responded to the fact that here was a huge rate crisis, you've got to act very quickly, shed loads of money have got to be spent on contracts for all sorts of things. There's no time for competitive contracts. There's no time for transparency. We can bung a lot of this stuff to our mates. And that's what happened. Now, so there again one can say, it's democracy that guarantees things like open contracting, transparency. It's only if we've got democracy strong can you have those things, and we do have those things. Our democracy is strong enough to have those things. But what you notice is, given an excuse to not follow all that, given an excuse for, I think that's to use the word, corruption, it was just immediately taken. So all those things that democracy gives us, that transparency, competition, openness, they're absolutely necessary. We can't say, oh, it's all right, we can trust them all. They're all honest blokes. They're not. Or they might not be. So, in a way, the dangers of further lurches towards post-democracy were revealed there. The other thing I said would happen, I said could happen. I said there could now be what I called a COVID moment. Because the COVID crisis produced quite an extraordinary effect on the whole of society. Not just the actual way we got locked up and the way we're all terrified, but we were all following the news and political developments and what government was doing and saying, glued to television sets in a way people aren't normally. Few political junkies are, but most people don't. They watch the news perhaps twice a day, possibly. Here, suddenly, we all were paying attention to the political arena and to government. And I thought, surely this will strengthen democracy because people are now going to be much more switched on. And there will also, the other part of the COVID moment, I thought, would be people would realize we had collective needs. And if you've got collective needs, then you need politics and government. So I predicted a sort of strengthening. It sort of happened in a sort of weak way. I mean, the European Union completely changed its approach to deficits, for example. There was certainly much more interest in health policy and so forth. So I think there has been a kind of weak COVID moment, that the focusing of attention. So people say, no, this is important. It's no good you saying I'm not interested in politics, nothing to do with me. It is important. It's affecting your life. It did sort of happen, actually. As I say, not as strongly as one might have dreamt, but it was there. But the third thing that happened, I didn't expect at all, and it's relevant to post-democracy. And that was the rise of conspiracy theories. There was already a lot of conspiracy theory around, but my goodness, the anti-vax movement, movement saying COVID never actually existed. It was all a plot by the deep state to keep us locked up during the day. And that's then moved on so that a few city councils say, we'd like to have a 15-minute city. We think every citizen should be able to find, within 15 minutes walk of their house, a chemist shop, a local convenience store, a doctor's surgery. This is now being attacked as a plan to imprison the population. Even the Prime Minister has repeated that conspiracy theory in the last 2 weeks. So what has happened here is that trust in politics has got so low that people are very willing, a large number of people, it's probably not a majority, a large number of people are very willing to listen to arguments that say these are terrible deep plots being hatched against you all around here. There's something called the deep state and the blob that keeps on doing all this stuff to you, and you've got to resist it. This, in a way, it's a kind of symptom of post-democracy. But it's also an attempt by people to react against post-democracy. Sadly, because it means, if anyone reads my book, they're quite likely to believe conspiracy theories. And that now leads me then into my third theme, and that is what's normally called populism. And of course the conspiracy theories are part of the populist thing. Now, I don't like the concept of populism. I try to avoid using it, but it's impossible because if you want to talk about some phenomenon, it's the only shortcut to getting people to understand what you're talking about. Now, for me, populism in its simplest meaning simply means groups who feel excluded from the political world are banging on the door and asking to be let in. So my image is a sort of polite conversation going on around a table with the respectable interests. And there's some people outside, they've not been allowed in, and they're banging on the door saying, let us in, let us in. And it may be, and in fact that's very much part of my idea of a strong democracy, right? It's people banging on the door saying, let us in, we're not being listened to. And it may be they simply want to be admitted, to be part of the political family. Right? And so my initial response to populism is not hostile. I said, let's look at what's happening here really. Also, there are different kinds of populism. And in Latin America, you mainly get a populism that's, one would say, is on the political left. In Europe and the United States, we're facing a populism of the xenophobic right, but you can also have a populism of the centre. Emmanuel Macron is, in my view, a populist of the centre because he came in disruptive force, right? Almost all political parties, apart from the Front National, just were crushed when he set up his En Marche movement. It disposed of most of the political scenery of France. But he's of the centre, in some sort of way. Then you can also have populists, in a way, perhaps the purest populists, are those where you can't locate them anywhere. And the original populist, a man called Huey Long, governor of Louisiana in the interwar years, he was a populist. He wanted to represent the people who were not represented, and he became governor of this state. And he did a whole load of stuff, social welfare stuff, but people never trusted him. And they couldn't really tell where he was. And was he just using his movement as a vehicle for Huey Long's own advancement? Eventually he was shot, and so we never found out what happened to him. Also another movement, a more contemporary populist movement where you can't really tell what it is the Movimento 5 Stelle, the five-star movement in Italy, which started by a comedian ridiculing the politicians, ridiculing post-democratic politicians, really, corrupt politicians. Turned itself into a movement. Then it became a political party. And in the last election but one, it became temporarily the biggest political party in Italy. It makes policy through the internet. People who belong to it send in ideas for policies. And if enough come in on one side, then that's their policy. So that you can't tell where they are, right? They seem to be on the political left. But then they'll suddenly surprise you with something they say. So you can have populism all over the place, right? The question to ask about populist movements is, what do they actually do once they get going? And unfortunately, there is a rather familiar trajectory, which is not democratic. And that's why, although they look like people who've read my book, who found we're the answer to post-democracy, actually, most of them are dangerous, not all of them. Because what happens, usually, it's organized around a particular individual, usually a man, but there is Marine Le Pen, and there is the Italian woman whose name I've suddenly forgotten. But usually it's a man, and he has a movement around him that's rather inchoate, right? It's not structured usually, so that it hasn't got sort of sections and policy-making groups and so forth. There's this one bloke who's there in the middle, and he says, I represent the will of the people. I represent the people who are being excluded by the elites. Therefore, next step in the argument, what I say is the will of the people, because I understand the people. I know what they want. Therefore, actually, I don't really need to consult them very much. I mean, in a way, the interpretation of the Brexit referendum was a perfect example of populism by Boris Johnson, because the vote was just a vote to leave the European Union. It didn't say how, what form. And he said, now I understand the people, and I know what Brexit has to be, right? Brexit is what I say it is. Didn't need to go back and consult anyone else. And that would be a very typical populist move. And that then, the next stage then, is anyone who stands in my way is an enemy of the people, because I am the voice of the people. So in particular, judges, law courts, any restraining institution becomes an enemy of the people if they get in the way of the leader, not just about his public business, but often also about his own personal financial affairs. And if you look at the populist figures, there's the guy in Venezuela on the left, who I've forgotten his name now. It's a left and right thing, but in Europe and the United States, we're mainly familiar with the populism of the right, and in a minute I'm going to try and explain why that is the case. Donald Trump, Johnson, Orban in Hungary, Erdogan, Netanyahu, Salvini for a while in Italy, though he's been knocked down a bit now, and until this week, Duda in Poland. All of them have regarded the law as something that's in their way, and therefore is an enemy of the people, and they will therefore change the constitution, ignore the law, because they represent this higher value. Now, my takeaway from this, my main takeaway for theories about post-democracy, are that this shows that democracy is not enough. Democracy has to be protected from itself. Or at least it has to be protected from the people it produces, because there is always going to be a disjunct between the interests of the people we elect and ourselves. That to claim that you are the embodiment of the people is always untrue. But partly, of course, because the people are always divided among themselves. And so another nasty part of saying I am the will of the people means that people who disagree with me aren't people. They're not real people. And you'll often hear this said, actually. You're not real people. You just live in North London. You know. And so the dependence of democracy on something that is itself not democratic. So judges are not democratically accountable and must not be. Government statistical services need to be completely neutral. If they start to get under political control, you don't even know the nature of the world you're living in. Government information services need to be non-political. Agencies like National Audit Office and things of that kind that monitor and regulate government, they need to be non-political. And to say that it's undemocratic, as some ministers have been saying the last couple of weeks, all these agencies, they haven't got a democratic mandate from the people. No, that's precisely what they're there for. because you've got the mandate from the people, but you can't be trusted because you're a human being, not because you're wicked. You're just a human being. You can't be trusted. So we need monitoring that is itself actually outside of democracy. And then, of course, there's a complex relationship at the point of lawmaking, where, in a way, law itself, of course, needs something outside. Every institution needs something outside of itself to regulate it in the last instance. And, of course, law does, because then the Parliament comes in as a law-making thing, but then Parliament and government have to sit back. We've made the law, now we must obey it. Families need institutions outside themselves. If you get a society, as in ancient Rome, where the head of a family can do what he likes with members of it, including kill them, then there is something very wrong. There has to be always an appeal outside the framework of even democratic institutions. It's also important that people are able to appeal in an ideal, in a good world, people would be able to appeal for against bad treatment by all the institutions of their country by going to international courts. And that's why after the Second World War it was largely conservative and liberal judges and lawmakers who set up the European Court of Human Rights. This was the memory of Nazism, the very real threat of Soviet communism. They said people must have a way of escaping the judgment of their own society, because it couldn't ever work, because the Soviet Union were never going to accept it. But it was a conservative institution that said people must be able to escape the boundaries of their state. Otherwise, you're saying the state is always sovereign over the individual, which is a very non-conservative, non-liberal argument to make. But you'll hear it from surprising sources today. So, populists are a problem because they don't respect these things. And the rule of law, therefore, becomes fundamental to democracy, even though it stands outside it. I remember about 20 years ago, I had some friends in the law department at the University of Madison, Wisconsin, and they'd invited Jürgen Habermas over to give some lectures. And the conservative members of their department were absolutely livid. They said, this is a Marxist, this is a man who supported East Germany up to a point, this is outrageous you bringing him here. Well, Habermas came, and his lectures were all about the Rechtsstaat, the state under, German for the state under law. And at the end of it, my friends were all disappointed, and the conservatives were all very happy, because Habermas talked about the fundamental importance of the state under the rule of law. And he was right. Now, I said there's various kinds of populism, and at the moment in Europe and the United States, and not only there, the populism we have is very much tied to xenophobia, to a dislike of foreigners in general, a dislike of foreign institutions, a dislike of immigrants and of ethnic minorities. Now, that's not the only populism you can have. I mean, you can have, in Latin America, you get a populism in behalf of disenfranchised peasants. Why is populism taking the form it does in the West at the moment? Now, at the beginning I said, I thought there were three movements in the present day that really continued to give political elites a big shock, and that they were a sign that there was a democracy, that there was still health in it. One of these was feminism. Now, wait a minute, let's go back a stage. Second thing I said, quickly, was that there was a kind of disconnect today between large numbers of people and political parties. Now, most people are not very political, but they do vote, and they will often answer the question as to what their politics is. A decreasing number do this, decreasing number vote, decreasing number have a political identity. But for quite a long time, certainly after the Second World War, the vast majority of people in a country could answer the question, who are you politically? And they will often answer that question, and still do, using the verb to be. Not I vote Conservative, I vote Social Democrat, but I am. Right? So the expression of your politics is often an expression of part of your identity. Now, we all have a lot of identities. It might be a football team, might be the town we live in, our profession. And so we have multiple identities, and we like to have these. We like to reinforce them. They locate us among our associates. We know who our people are. So social identity is actually, we all have lots of them, and social identities are very precious. And if you can say, well, I've got certain social identities, and some of these lead me to a particular political identity, then you've got a nice reassurance. I've got a political identity because it corresponds to who I am, right? I'm a Roman Catholic, here's a Roman Catholic party, I vote for it, I am it. Now, coming out of the awful traumas of the first half of the 20th century, in particular, two forms of social identity formed political identities in Western Europe. Eastern Europe, people didn't get a chance to have one. These were social class, based on partly on relationship to agriculture and partly on industrialization. And the other one was religion. The American story is a different story. There is a story, but it's not. I'm telling the European story because that's what I know about, and it's where Britain is. Now, gradually over the years, over the decades, we ceased to be an industrial society. The identities forged in the struggles around industrial workers seeking citizenship. The conflicts were resolved, and new occupations in new sectors, mainly in services, arrived, which didn't have that history. So it was much more difficult in post-industrial society, for your occupation to give you a political identity. Not entirely true, but it was a general trend. Religion, and here's a huge contrast between Europe and the United States, religion has declined enormously, and in particular has declined in its political meaning. The churches are no longer associated with political positions that they used to have back in the 1950s. So religion doesn't give you many clues either. In Britain, only half the population have a religious identity anyway. And so people have problems finding a political identity. That's not necessarily a problem for democracy, but it does mean that what we've become accustomed to as how people knew who they were politically, that is in some kind of vacuum. Now I go back to where I started before I remembered to say all that bit. I said there were these three movements. Now, let's interrogate these three movements and see to what extent they help with the problem of giving people a political identity. First, take feminism, which is, gender is the most powerful, I was going to say clear, it isn't anymore, but reasonably clear identity that people have that has enormous implications for their lives, enormous implications for where they're included and where they're excluded. But feminism, it can't really produce political identities because for a political identity to exist, people do have to spend at least a large part of their lives in communities made up of similar persons. And so long as men and women live together as father and daughter, or mother and son, husband and wife, as long as people, the brother and sister, as long as people live like that, then gender is too dangerous an issue to be the basis of really important political identities. There are, of course, a lot of people who have, within a family, who have different political identities, and they rub along, or sometimes they don't rub along. But you can't. It's very difficult to make that the basis of an entire of a major political identity system. So feminism has this vast importance, but it can't solve the problem of political identity. Maybe exception to that, actually, in Spain. Remember, macho is a Spanish word. There was a small... most countries in Europe now have a right-wing populist party. In Spain had a little tiny one called Vox, and it tried to do what all these pop movements do, which is to stir up hatred of Muslims, and it wasn't getting them anywhere, really. And then a few years ago, a young girl was raped by a group of young men. and there was a trial, and they were sent to prison, but a lot of their defence had been that she was drunk. Vox saw an opportunity here. They said, we will represent the cause that those men represent. We will take up the cause of men like that. And they immediately started to get quite a lot of votes. In the last general election, they actually campaigned on an anti-feminist platform as their main issue. And the Conservative Party, Partido Popular in Spain, has decided they are people it's willing to go into coalition with. It already governs Madrid alongside them. Now, if you want to understand what was going on in Spanish women's football this year, that helps you. So gender can become a political issue in that partisan way, but most parties will try and avoid it. Secondly, the environmental movement. Now, the problem the environmental movement has is that it's not really well, I'm going to correct this in a minute, but I'll start off by saying, at first sight, it is not an identity thing. Right? You can say, I am working class, therefore I vote for the Labour Party. I'm a Roman Catholic, therefore I vote for the Christian Democrats. You can't be a green in the same sense. Being green is an acknowledgement that certain issues are really important. So it seems to be, on the surface, not a social identity that can be translated into a political one. And I think otherwise, how do we explain the fact that whereas green movements have been around since the end of the 1970s, and although they're now talking about the biggest single thing affecting the world, they are small compared with xenophobic movements that have only been around for a decade. And I think one of the answers to that question is that they're not an identity question. Now, as I say, I think that's largely true, but there are certain ways in which it's not true. I think increasingly the environmental concern is beginning to be a generational issue. It's young people, their lives and their children's lives, their grandchildren's lives, they can see ahead as being really bleak. Whereas older people around today say, well, it's going to be all right for me, I just get better summers. And so there is a real, and young people feel this, there is a generational issue about the climate crisis. Second interesting fact, and I suppose it overlaps with that one, support for green parties is almost limited to and is extremely strong in metropolitan cities. And so where occupations have certain characteristics is where quite a high proportion of well-educated people work, actually. So there are social characteristics of green voters. So in a way, although I always say it can't be a social identity, I think that might be changing, but still a minoritarian social identity. Then finally, we turn to xenophobia. Nationalism. Here you have a social identity that we all have. Almost everyone, except a few stateless people, can say, I am British, I am German, I am Swiss. We've all got that. And it means quite a lot to us much of the time. In sporting occasions, it can mean an enormous amount. Most people are interested in some sort of sport. So we all have, as one of our social identities, our nation. And politicians will always reinforce it. Politicians talk about the nation and what they will do for the nation. That's the focus of 90% of political debate is about the nation. And, I've given it away, it's a social identity that immediately translates into politics, because it is political. The nation is a political thing. And I think this is why populists find xenophobia and nationalism in particular to be where they can get their traction at the present time, and very much linked to Islamophobia, given the various terrorist incidents of the last 20 years. So I think if you ask why are populists using xenophobia and nationalism, it's because there is a political identity vacuum in our societies, and that fills it very neatly. And there's various interesting examples that demonstrate it. There's the German party, Alternative für Deutschland, which is making great gains at the moment. For a long while it was limited to East Germany only, the old East, but it's gaining in the West. It started off as a party whose its only policy was the euro is hurting Germany and helping Southern Europe. A demonstrably false proposition. They got about 2% of the vote. They suddenly discovered they hated Muslims too. In Italy, there was a party called Lega Nord, which wanted the separation of the rich north, the Veneto and Lombardia, those areas, away from the rest of Italy. To be a country called Padania. And they got quite a bit of support in those areas, but obviously you couldn't become a national party if what you were saying is we really don't like the rest of the country. And then Matteo Salvini realized instead of being northern Italians hating southern Italians, you could be all Italians hating Muslims. Changed the name of the party to Lega, from Lega Nord, and became very rapidly a major party in the country. So this sort of nationalism, and especially when it's linked to Islamophobia, or anti-Europeanness sometimes, has traction, fills the vacuum. And I think this is therefore where we've reached clearly there are problems with democracy, and this is one of the ways it's being fueled. I can see a sort of future where the old parties live on because they don't go away. But then a new confrontation between urban metropolitan Greens and nationalists who live in large parts of the country go on. It's interesting that the places where nationalist parties, xenophobe parties, are weakest are in the big metropolitan cities. In Western Europe, they even in an area like Bavaria, where, well, that's not the nationalists actually, but no, take another region. But various regions, take northern Italy. Milan, you don't find a triumph of the nationalist group. In Eastern Europe is very similar, except that the metropolitans who are opposed to the nationalists are neoliberals, free market people. And the election in Poland this week was about that conflict mainly. So there we are. Well, where are we? Final conflict to talk about, which happened after my book, so this is all new, is Ukraine. Ukraine's democracy, I'm talking about the years running up to the war. The war is obviously, everything has changed, but formal democracy in Ukraine was very weak. Like most of Eastern Europe, every election saw a diminishing proportion of the population voting. And then eventually have a presidential election where they elect Zelensky, who is a television personality, and it looked as though this is non-serious. Now, he's turned out to be the most impressive statesman in the world, but that's not what they thought he was when they voted for him. Meanwhile, Ukraine has had the most extraordinary civil society. When they had pro-Russian governments trying to tear up agreements that an earlier government had made that Ukraine should eventually join the European Union, there were mass demonstrations. People were actually shot and killed by pro-Russian troops for demonstrating for entry into the European Union. So there was extraordinary strength of civil society, which is also carrying that country through its war. So you can have a complete disconnect between a very weak formal democracy and very strong civil societies. It's a dangerous disconnect, really. There is something similar in Italy. You talk to Italians, they'll say, well, those people in Rome, they're all corrupt, they can do what they like, they live in a world of their own. In our city, we can get on with doing something, so just don't bother with them. But eventually you end up with a political system in deep crisis. So there needs to be a bridge. We're increasing, and this is where I started with coping with post-democracy. I'm saying in civil society we mustn't turn our backs on politics and parties. We've got to, civil society institutions have got to be politically active. They've got to make a noise. They've got to be saying things. You see that because when we talk about democracy, we're really talking about two different things to make a rich, healthy democracy. There's formal democracy, which is voting, elections, forming parliaments. where we have amazingly strict rules, almost ridiculous rules, to ensure everything's fair and just. And then we have informal democracy, which is a chaos. And this is where anyone in society can organise groups to lobby government. The two live alongside each other. One is very formal, only happens every few years. The other one is continuous and a sort of turmoil. And if you imagine society without one of these, you realise it doesn't work. I mean, the original aim of the French revolutionaries was that you wouldn't have any organised groups in society. There would be the individu et l'État, the individual and the state. And the individual votes and forms a parliament, forms a government, and that then rules. The individuals keep their individual freedoms, but you don't want groups in between. You certainly don't want the Catholic Church. So you had the individual and the state there. And of course it gives you absolutely dry, empty democracy. Because once you can't really talk to government except as individuals in between times. You can't have civil society without formal politics because you won't have a government. So these two groups, the people in the formal politics, the people in informal politics, they need each other. They're absolutely interdependent, but they usually dislike each other intensely. Politicians regard civil action groups as a nuisance. They raise questions that they can't control. And they use resources and money that could easily go to party funds instead. And the civil society groups usually regard politicians very cynically. And if we're going to get out of this growing disconnect, the need for civil society and politics to reconnect, to find ways of reconnecting, is the only way we're going to make a world that is not just dominated in the coming years by nationalism. Okay, finished.